Are those all your trophies in the background?
No, it's my daughter's old bedroom. So she was an athlete in high school.
Yeah, I played football and chess. Those are the two things I lettered in high school.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. She was in basketball mostly, and then she did some rowing, and then did some rowing in college as well, which worked out real well for her.
Nice. That's a very active sport. I tried doing that in the gym a few times. It's
Yeah,
exhausting.
yeah. No, it works everything, and it's good aerobic as well.
How is the sound? Question mark. Asking in the audience because that's always the only surefire way to make sure everything is working. Make sure the audience can hear you.
Right. Yeah, I hear you fine on my end.
I've had a few where that was the person I was speaking to could hear me fine, but the people in the audience couldn't hear either of us. And that was
Oh
like
dear.
we just
Yeah.
saw our lips moving, thought we were like miming. It's like new
Oh
new
dear.
new
Yeah.
form of art on YouTube. Just
Yeah.
all right,
Yeah, I haven't
everything.
used this whereby before, so it's
This is the
you
easiest one
it's
I found. It's
useful.
the simplest because it doesn't require any login or download of any kind. It's just click and go. Where I like it.
Yeah.
All right, it looks like we're live. So, Professor Koons, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I teach philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin. Been there for 33 years. Did my graduate work at Oxford and UCLA. Mostly do metaphysics, some philosophy of science, but philosophy of religion is definitely an area of concentration as well.
Cool. So I wanted to follow up with you based on our last conversations. We got about half the questions I really had about Thomism, and so I wanted to follow up
Okay.
on that. The first thing I wanted to ask about was the simplicity criterion for Thomism and God, because it seems like the definition of what qualifies as simplicity seems kind of arbitrary. For example, you could define a brute contingency to be the simplest possible thing as opposed to a brute necessity. And how would you determine one would be simpler than the other?
Right. Um, so I think the arguments for necessity and simplicity are probably separate. Um, Usually, one would argue that the first cause has to be necessary, just on the grounds that something that's contingent, really demands an explanation for why it exists rather than not existing. Right? In a way that things that are necessary may or may not do so. Um, but let's see, what else would I say here? On the other hand, I prefer focusing on simplicity, which I think is actually also Aquinas's main focus. So necessity ends up being a kind of byproduct, really, of simplicity rather than the other way around. So I guess you're asking on that score, right? Why I think you can get from simplicity to necessity. Let's say. Right. Okay. Let's think about that for a minute. So if something is so simple that um, its nature is simply existing, then it's really hard to see what its existing could be contingent on, right? Because it doesn't have existence as a kind of added characteristic the way ordinary things do, right? And that's why ordinary things are contingent because something has to add existence to them. So here we're talking about something where existing is just its nature, its whole, um, its only characteristic in a sense. Um, and I think it's pretty plausible that that would be necessary.
So from my perspective, if I think about it as having one thing that has this absolute property of existence, that's like having one infinite thing, but that doesn't seem to be any simpler than having infinitely many contingent things. So if we just have infinite things of a power of one versus one thing of a power of infinite, those seem to be of equal simplicity to me. So I don't see the difference between saying there's this one thing that has this essence of existence versus having infinitely many things that just happen to exist. Those seem to be equivalent.
Okay, good. Let's think about that for a bit. So let's suppose we had an infinite number of finite things, right? Well, so there's at least two areas where a lack of simplicity is going to come into it. One is if each of the things is individually finite, there's going to have to be some kind of particular boundary or quantity or limit to its existence. So right there, there's a lack of simplicity, a deviation from pure simplicity.
What do you mean? Because a limit doesn't seem to be something that makes something less simple. It actually seems to make it more simple if it has a limit. So, for example, an apple is more simple than a computer because it has more limits, not less.
Right, right. So, but still, both of them, I mean, from a certain point of view, they're both sort of equally. Let's see how to put this. Um, I mean, let's take something like a even clearer case, like a single particle electron, right? You might say, okay, so that's like really simple compared to a computer. Computer's got lots and lots of electrons. Yeah, that's right. But it's also got fewer limits, right? A lot fewer limits than the computer. And so, just from that point of view, you might think, okay, to be absolutely simple would be to have zero limits, right? That would be the maximum kind of simplicity that you could have. Because if so, the electron has a certain mass, right? Every electron is so many hundred times less massive than the proton, right? And it could be twice that, half that, 10% more, 5% less. So there's a specific boundary, right? If you look at the inside of your physics textbook, right, they'll list the mass of electron, some long number, lots of digits, right? And that introduces an element of complexity, right? And physicists would like to explain that if they could, right? Because it's just kind of glaring lack of simplicity of the theory that you got this one particular number sitting there that can't be explained. So that, I think, is an indication of the fact that where you have a specific limit, that is a lack of represents some sort of lack of simplicity.
So, by a limit implies simplicity because it needs some explanation, essentially.
It implies a lack of simplicity, and
Well, how does a limit imply a lack of simplicity? Is it because that limit requires an explanation? Is that the argument?
well, I don't think that's the argument. Yeah, that's a good question. Let me see if I can explain this a little better. Um, so simplicity means that there's no combination whatsoever, right? And where you have a limitation, you have a kind of combination because you're combining something with something else that limits it. So in the case of the electron, you have mass, but then there's a limit to the mass, right? It's no more than 100 and some odd times less massive than the proton. So you've got mass and you've added a limit to it. And in this case, a specific limit, such and such a number. And so the combination of those two would be less simple than something that has that's just like pure mass, right, with no limit whatsoever. That would be simpler.
So, how to apply? Because it seems like taking an abstract object and saying the abstract is simpler than the concrete example. So, for example, this chair is more complex than the concept of chair, essentially.
Yeah, so I'm not saying that I'm not really making a distinction here between concrete and abstract things, because God isn't really an abstract thing. He's not just the abstract sense of existence that we might get by taking the sort of the lowest common denominator of all existing things. He's supposed to be concrete existence in its purest form, right? Without any limitations, without any kind of modifications or constraints or anything like that. And that's as simple as you can get, is the thought.
Oh, sure, I'm not going straight to God here. I'm just trying to take the definition
Right.
of limit and simplicity that you've provided and saying, if we take those definitions at face value, it seems that the abstract object of a chair would be simpler than the concrete object of a chair by those definitions.
I see. Okay, right. Yeah, I mean, maybe that's true. Chairs are pretty complicated. They've got lots and lots of parts and lots of specific limits, whereas an abstract notion of a chair is probably less limited. But it's still clearly limited, right? I mean, it involves, in fact, involves um, in this case, not just limits, but in fact, composition, right? Because you have to put together various ideas in order to get the notion of a chair, artifact, something that's useful for sitting, and then you have to explain what sitting is. And so there's a lot of complexity that's built into that abstract idea as well. But yeah, it probably is less complicated than the actual chair.
That seems counterintuitive to me. From my perspective, the actual chair seems to be far simpler than the concept of a chair, because the physical thing is very specific in the way it's defined. It has exact properties that can be measured in an exact way, whereas the concept of a chair is vague. It's just a kind of a vague notion that we kind of apply to things that could apply to infinitely many things. So you're right, it has no limits, but that actually makes it more complicated. It's less simple because it has less limits, and the more limits of the physical thing seem to make it a simpler thing because it's limited.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I guess I wouldn't identify vagueness and abstraction. Those seem to be two different things. So, so for instance, the number 5 million is definitely abstract, but it's not vague. It's pretty precise. Whereas if I say lots, right, that's vague and abstract, right? So, so yeah, I would agree that vague things probably are not very simple, right? Because there's a lot of complexities built into vagueness. And so to that extent, the concept of chair is pretty vague, I agree. And so, yeah, it's not particularly simple. But take something like, again, the number 1 million or something. I mean, that's going to be simpler than any pile of a million things, right? Because it's going to lack some of the extra specificity that's built into the concrete thing.
Sure, I think I
But
can.
even though it's not the simplest thing, right? I mean, obviously the number 1 would be simpler than the number 1 million, I think. 0, 1, those are really simple things.
Oh, for sure. So I think I would probably agree with that. The concept of a million, would it be simpler than a million particulars? Actually, I'm not sure I would. I think it might be more complex, because to have the idea of a million things seems like it would entail the physical possibility of a million things being there in the first place. So it seems like the physical possibility would have to precede the idea, and so the idea would be an addition onto the physical things. So I think it would be more complex, the idea.
I see. Yeah, that's interesting. Maybe that's right. I mean, I agree that there's something. There's a kind of dependency that something like numbers has on numbered things, right? So it's not really the most fundamental kind of entity. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I have to think about that. Let's see. I mean, suppose all human beings had exactly the same kind of nature, right? So there was a concept or a form that we could call human nature that's instantiated in all human beings, right? It doesn't mean that would be simpler than any particular human being, right? Because any particular human being would have that human nature plus all of the accidents that made them that particular individual, the particular matter they're composed of, the particular time and place they were born, and so on. All of that would be, in addition to the simplicity of the form of humanity itself. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I could use the same analogy with my chair. If there was some kind of chair property that existed in all chairs, then that chair property would be simpler than any particular chair, because the chair would have to have that chair property and all of the other properties. But it's equally possible that that chair property is just an abstract that we apply to it and doesn't actually exist in the chairs at all.
Right.
In which case, the chair property is actually more complex than the chair itself, because it's an addition to the chair that isn't actually there. And so,
right, good. Yeah, so I think we're getting into something fairly deep here, right? Which is a choice between a kind of nominalism versus realism about universals. And right, I think the Thomist approach here is going to depend upon rejecting that kind of nominalism.
Well, I would be more specific here, because it wouldn't necessarily be the nominalist position rejection of all universals. It could be just rejection of this one particular universal of simplicity or something.
Okay, well that's another question. But I mean, in your case of let's take human nature. I don't think there really is a chair nature, right? I don't think artifacts have natures in the same way that human beings do, or squirrels do, or something like that. So let's stick with something like human nature, right? Now, if that is simply a construction of the human mind that has no counterpart in nature, so to speak, then I think you'd be right that that human nature wouldn't be simpler than a given human being. And similarly, right? I mean, you might think that the nature of existing itself, right, wouldn't be simpler than other existing things, right? Because again, it would just be a concept that we'd abstracted as human beings from everything, right? So just kind of the null concept, right? The lowest common denominator concept that we might come up with. Right. So I think that's right. That's going to be a fundamental sort of question here, and it's not an easy question to resolve. I think. I mean, there's a case to be made for nominalism in the sense that you could say, look, it is a simpler account of the world. Actually, if you go back to simplicity again, you just have particulars, right? And you don't have to add universals into the story as well as particulars. So that's an interesting move. Now, I've written about this, and there's a couple of chapters in books on metaphysics that I've written where I try to turn the tables here and say, no, actually, realism is simpler than nominalism. Because, well, I mean, there are different kinds of nominalism, of course. There's what we might call really extreme nominalism, in which the idea is that we can make up concepts willy-nilly, right, as in our minds or in our language, in such a way that the application of our concept doesn't have anything to do with reality, right? So we have this concept of human beings. I mean, it applies to human beings, but that's just because we've kind of arbitrarily made it apply to these human beings. It's not the case that the human beings themselves are objectively similar in such a way as to make it natural for them to be grouped together.
Right? Like chairs.
So, yeah, right. Well, exactly. So I think chairs are as you said, it's a vaguer concept. So it's less clear that there's a real similarity there among chairs. I mean, chairs can be all kinds of shapes and so on. So there's less similarity. So one big issue here among nominalists is whether you think there's a kind of metaphysically fundamental relation of resemblance out there that's independent of the human mind or not, right? I don't know which way you would go. I mean, I think the no resemblance picture, right? And I mean, it makes it, I think it undermines the possibility of science, really. I mean, it means that science is just, it's a social construction, as they say, right? Something you sort of make up as you go along, and doesn't correspond to anything, objective or independent of us. So I would sort of set that aside and say the main competitor, I think, is this kind of objective resemblance sort of view. So there's particulars, they kind of objectively resemble each other to varying degrees. That creates a kind of natural a set of classes, natural classes of things, and then we come along and we stick concepts onto these natural classes. Right? So I think that's a pretty plausible picture. Now, a lot then depends upon what the world looks like. So suppose that we think that there are, I don't know, 60 basic kinds of particles, and plus, of course, there's all the different sorts of possible masses and charges and so on. So there's a lot of these sort of natural classes of resemblances out there. And let's see. Actually, there's a third view there I should mention. All right, so it gets more complicated. So there's the extreme view, resemblance view. There's also what we might call ostrich nominalism. So the ostrich nominalism, yeah, it was a term that was used by David Armstrong, who was an Australian metaphysician, to criticize certain kind of nominalists. And the idea was that you're sticking your head in the sand like an ostrich. You're refusing to look at a certain problem. So the ostrich nominalist says, there are no universals and there's no objective resemblance, but it's not just loosey-goosey, whatever you want. There are certain, things, let's say things resemble each other because they're all red or they're all electrons, or they all have a certain mass. So the idea would be that there are no universals, but there is a kind of vocabulary that's privileged that you can use to describe the world, and that is the scientifically appropriate sort of vocabulary to use, right? And so that's I think also an attractive picture. So ostrich nominalism, resemblance nominalism, and realism, I think those are the main competitors. So the main objection to ostrich nominalism is this is where simplicity comes in. Well, actually, in all the cases it does. So the main objection to ostrich nominalism is that they have to say that metaphysically speaking, the fact that some things are electrons and other things are protons and other things are quarks and other things are maybe quasars and so on, that these facts have no deeper metaphysical explanation. You've hit rock bottom already once you reach that level. And that means really that your account of the world has a kind of complexity to it, right? You've got a very large number of fundamental categories that can't be reduced to anything else. Now, both the resemblance nominalist and the realist has an advantage here, because they can say, well, no, I can explain what it is to be an electron. It's to instantiate the electron universal, or it's to resemble each other to a certain strong degree so that electrons form a natural class, and then we put the label electron on it. So both the resemblance nominalist and the realist has a further explanation of this fact of the, you might call it the categorical complexity of the world, right? Whereas the ostrich nominalist says, no, we have to stop at just the plain facts, so to speak. Right? Can't go any deeper. So my argument is that it's an analogy, let's say, to what happens in science when we went from the periodic table of 192 elements to just 3 or 4 basic particles, right? You actually ended up with more things, right? Because instead of having just 1 million atoms here, you now got 50 million fundamental particles. So you've actually ended up with more things quantitatively. But you've achieved a huge qualitative simplicity, because you go from 192 elements down to just 3 basic particles, electrons, protons, neutrons, right? So you accomplished some simplicity there. And in the same way, the resemblance nominalist or the realist goes from this vast, much more than 192 different categories, down to some simple facts about resemblance or about universals and instantiation. So they've achieved a kind of simplicity. Now we still have to deal with resemblance theory, and so here it gets a lot more technical. But the difficulty here is that that when you try to work out the details of resemblance theory, it ends up getting pretty complicated because of facts about degrees of resemblance come into play, and sort of problems of collective resemblance come into play. So I think it ends up being very plausible to think that that some kind of universal is needed. Now, I think the Aristotelian actually has an advantage here over the Platonists. So there are now 2 kinds of realists, right? The Platonists just posit universals so there's a human universal, electron universal, and so on. And you explain the similarity of things based on their instantiating the same universal. The Aristotelian, I think, can get rid of the universals, and so in a way, he's closer to the nominalist, because he says that that there's a sameness among things, but it's not to be understood just as a kind of brute resemblance relation. It's rather the fact that there's something there in each of them that would be identical if it hadn't been made plural by something else. So the way I think about it is this: you and I both have something in us that's human nature. That's not a universal, actually. It's a thing in me and a thing in you. And they don't just happen to resemble each other. There's a more intimate relationship there, which is my human nature, your human nature would actually be one and the same thing if it weren't for the fact that mine's attached to this matter and yours is attached to that matter. So there's a kind of explanation for the multiplicity of these things. There's also a kind of deep metaphysical explanation of the sameness of things, this sort of would-be identical fact that lies behind it all. And that kind of Aristotelian, which is sometimes called moderate realism, That I think is in some sense the background of a lot of the moves that the Thomist wants to make. So the thought is that when we think about existing, we would reach a similar kind of conclusion. We might say there's a sort of active existence in me and an active existence in you, right? And those acts of existence are made different by the fact that, that we have different matter. Or between me and, let's say, the squirrel, right? The two acts of different existence are made different by the fact that they actualize different natures, human nature versus squirrel nature. And then you have, finally, God as the pure active existence, right? That isn't added to anything else, so to speak. That's what makes it simple. And that's what makes it the sort of ultimate ground for explanation for everything else, right? You and I exist because of some sort of causal relationship to that pure active existence.
Okay, so couldn't I reject, or I could adopt realism, say I grant realism that there are universals, but I could say this particular universal that you are asserting isn't a real universal. It's just an abstract like chair. So if you're saying existence is a real universal that applies to all things and all things have this existence property, and then I could say, well, no, there isn't really this existence property. There's really just energy. And if you have energy, then we just classify that as existing or something like that. So it seems like for any particular class of things, you could say, no, it's not really a class of universals. That's just an abstract thing. And couldn't we apply that to the same kind of ideas that you apply to God?
Yeah. Okay. Good. So let's think about that for a minute. So let's say we're realists about at least some things. So there are some universals, and but let's say that they're more closely tied to science in some way, right? So charge, maybe being an electron, baryon number, things like this. So there are various universals that are tied to science, and then let's see. And then we would just deny that there's such a thing as existence. Sure. So I think that the way that the picture works here is, maybe I gave a false impression here in saying that the realism is a kind of background for the Thomistic argument. I think it is, but it doesn't work this way. It doesn't, I think, work this way. The Thomist says, oh, well, we can see that there must be this universal existence, and so therefore there's a God who's pure existence. That would be the sort of Anselm kind of line, the object argument kind of line would go something like that. Just define God as pure existence and therefore exists, and we're done, right? And that's not the way the Thomist works. So I think the Thomist would say, no, we sort of discovered that there must be such a thing as a universal of existence, and we do that through something like the first cause kind of argument. So we're looking for something that's absolutely simple, right, to be the first cause. And as we sort through all the different possibilities, we realize that the only thing that could really be absolutely simple would be this being of pure existence.
So if pure existence is a discovery, and we discovered it through the contingency argument, then couldn't the contingency argument have a solution that isn't perfectly simple? Like, why would that entail perfect simplicity to begin with?
Yeah. So the question then has to do with the nature of the causal principle that we're working with. So I want to argue that the causal principle that we really need to operate with is one that says anything that has any kind of complexity has to have causal explanation.
Well, isn't that begging the question?
Well, so I agree. It's a big assumption, and you assume that, then yeah, you're more than halfway home, right? So this is why a lot of my recent work has been focused on this question, which is why I believe such a strong principle of causation, right? And so my main argument there is to say, well, a couple of arguments I can make, but they're mostly epistemological in character. So the thought is that in order to do science, in order to have empirical knowledge, we have to operate with a very strong principle of causality. And I'm arguing you have to really adopt a super strong principle of causality. So yeah, I'll put it sort of more simply first, and then maybe we can talk about the more complicated argument. But I mean, we want science to be as expansive as possible, right? We don't want to have any kind of a priori limitations to what science can do. We don't want to say, "Oh, science, you've discovered this. You have to stop. You can't look for any further explanations for that." And that means, I think, that whenever we find something that isn't God, basically, that has any kind of limitation or complexity to it, then it's always legitimate, at least, to ask what caused it, what explains this thing. If you start saying no, you can't do that, right? Here's a limit, right? Then you're arbitrarily limiting science. So I'll give an example. So at one point, Graham Oppy says, okay, once you got to the beginning of time, you have to stop, right? You can't ask, what caused that or what explained that. And I want to say, well, let's look at this. I mean, the beginning of time turns out to be this very specific, sort of complex thing, a certain amount of energy and entropy and whatnot. Why couldn't you ask, what caused that, right? Maybe there's some deeper, physical mechanism even that caused it. So we don't want to, arbitrarily legislate the science. You can go thus far and no farther. And one way to see that, one way to get there, at least, is to say, let's have this really, really powerful causal principle that says, not only you don't have to stop, you must not stop, right? You must keep going until you've gotten to the thing the one thing that absolutely can't be explained, which is this being of absolute pure simplicity. So that's one way to think about it. The other way I've argued is that you get into a kind of slippery slope towards skepticism if you don't adopt this really strong principle of causality, because I've got all kinds of experiences and sensations and memories and so on, and I use those facts to infer a whole superstructure of scientific theory and so on. The world's a billion years old and blah blah blah. Right? Now, suppose that it turned out that it's quite possible that complex things like that could just exist without a cause at all. They can just happen with no cause whatsoever. If I take that seriously, then I'd have to take seriously a kind of extreme, like Cartesian skepticism. It's even worse than Descartes' skepticism. At least he had an evil demon who was causing these illusions. I could just have the illusions with no evil demon behind them at all. And so clearly, we don't have to take that seriously. I think we can say that that's not a real possibility. But to rule that out, we really have to appeal to some kind of causal principle. You have to say these things are complex. Therefore, they must have a cause. Therefore, they couldn't have just popped into existence without any explanation. And again, if you say, well, okay, let's say that anything that happens after the first moment of time has to have a cause, but things at the first moment don't, then my response is, but wait a minute, how do I know that I'm not right now at the first moment of time? I've got memories and so on, but they could have popped into existence right now as well. So again, any kind of limitation of that sort that would require empirical verification in principle is going to be viciously circular here. So I have to be able to appeal sort of unconsciously or implicitly to a causal principle that's really, really powerful, that enables me to escape that kind of skepticism.
How would the same problem not apply to a God hypothesis? For example, I could say, maybe I'm the God and I just don't realize it, or maybe I just like refreshed my memories or wiped my memories so I didn't remember I was a God or something. It seems like the same kind of skepticism would apply to a God as it does to the naturalistic hypothesis.
Yeah, so a couple things here. So if I had to worry that my present experiences, memories, and so on, that each of they collectively might actually be God, then you're right. Then you'd think, well, why couldn't they have existing, causelessly? But the whole idea of God, again, is that there's no limitation or boundary to or complexity to God. And so if I look at any of my experiences or memories, they have very clear boundaries and limitations. There's a certain quantity of space involved, or a certain kind of intensity of color or feeling or whatever. And so the very sort of specificity of those experiences is such as to give me, I think, a priori grounds for assuming that they're not. This is being of absolute simplicity.
So, how would it? Because this goes back to my question about complexity of a single thing that has infinite or pure existence, as opposed to infinitely many concrete things that have one unit of existence. It seems like those are equivalent, and saying that there is one pure existence thing seems to be equal to saying there are infinitely single units of existence.
Yeah, right. So we're coming back around to that point again, and I never really finished my answer to that. So one answer was, you've got a limitation to each of those units, right? A kind of boundary to those units, and then you've multiplied it by a million. So there's actually a lot of complexity there that would be lacking in the case of a single infinite being. And secondly, there's just the fact that, how do you put all these thousand or million individual existences together into a world at all? Right? There has to be some kind of combination of them, and that requires, again, more complexity. Right? What is it that puts all the different physical events together into a single world of space and time? Right? There'd have to be some kind of tie or connection between these things that would make them all part of a single world, and that would again be adding to the complexity of the whole, as opposed to just a single being who's non-spatial, non-temporal, unlimited, just a being of pure existence.
Well, I don't think I would agree with that, because I think that if there was a being of pure existence who could create this universe with those same connections, that would then entail all of those same connections plus the perfect being of existence.
Yeah, sure, but I mean, that's fine. That's like saying, I've got this atomic theory that I'm using the 4 particles to explain 192 elements. You say, but you've got 4 particles and 192 elements. There's no gain. I say, no, yeah, sure there is, because I've sort of explained where the 192 elements came from. So I think there's a difference between having a huge number of primitive things for which there's no explanation versus a single very simple thing, and then lots of stuff that's explained by the simple thing in some respect.
So yeah, that led back to my question, like what makes it simpler? Is it the fact that it has an explanation that's what makes it simpler? Because I think you mentioned that earlier when you were talking about simplicity.
Yeah. Well, okay, that's a good question. So clearly they're correlated for me, right? I want to say simpler things, a very simple thing doesn't need explanation, complicated things do. So you're asking sort of which way does the connection work here? Is it that something simpler because it doesn't need explanation, or the other way around? I think it's the other way around. I think it's simplicity that explains why something doesn't need an explanation versus why it does. But yeah, we're getting down to a deep question here about what the nature of the causal principle or explanatory principle, if you want to call it, is going to be. I mean, I think we should all agree that we need some such principle, right? And so then the question is, what's the nature of it? What is it that makes something? What sort of things need explaining, right? And why, right? Those are definitely deep questions.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's, I think, my definite struggling point with Thomism, because it seems like saying that there is a brute contingent universe, to me, seems no fundamentally different or even simpler than saying there is a brute necessary entity. Those don't seem to be substantively different. There doesn't seem to be one that's simpler than the other in any particular way, because it seems like the only reason that one is simpler is because you've defined simplicity to be that thing. Whereas we could just define simplicity to be a brute contingent universe. That's the perfectly simple thing. And well, you just don't understand simplicity, because there's real simplicity is this. And there doesn't seem to way to differentiate between those two definitions of simplicity to show which one actually corresponds to reality. If this idea of simplicity is one of those real things like human nature that exists in reality, as opposed to just being a chair that doesn't, it's just an abstract label. And those stumbling blocks make it hard for me to accept that argument as plausibly describing reality until there's some way to show that this does correspond to reality with this particular definition as opposed to this one.
Yeah, good. So, I mean, yeah, the statement, there's a brute contingency, is probably just as simple as the statement, there's a brute necessity, right? So that's right. But in the same way, I don't know, in some languages like Spanish, right? The symbol for one and the symbol for a million have the same simplicity, right? They're both three-letter words, let's say. Um, but clearly the thing itself is going to be more complex. So if I say, okay, where's my stopping point? Where do I stop and say, okay, this is fine? You say, well, here it is. You start with something like the Big Bang, plus all of the fundamental constants inside of our physics book. That's my stopping point. And I say, well, here's my alternative, being pure existence, no boundaries. It just seems to me there's very clear intuitive sense in which the second is a simpler explanation than the first, right? There's just lots and lots of brute facts, right? And each fact about one of the original particles, how much mass it had, what charge it had, what its original velocity was, that's all going to go into it. Again, all the ratios between the forces and blah, 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 maybe whatever it is that connects all these things together to make a single space-time world. So, it seems to me intuitively a sense in which I'm taking on an awful lot of stuff, and I'm, for some reason, not allowed to ask what caused it or what explained it. Whereas in the Thomistic picture, one thing, very simple. In fact, it is as simple as any human mind can conceive of anything being. And that I think, I find that pretty compelling myself.
Yeah, I think that my intuitions definitely disagree, because I see, like, if there was a perfectly simple thing, I would be more inclined to think it was created by some less simple thing. For example, like when we design things, we usually design things that are better than humans. Like computers can do things better than humans in many ways, and I definitely think we're going to make an AI that's going to supersede humanity in every possible way. So if there was a perfectly simple thing, I would think the opposite was the case. That was actually a designed thing, like a tesseract on a beach. I wouldn't think it was just there innately. I think that was the thing that needs an explanation. And the more random, less orderly looking thing is the one that doesn't really need an explanation.
Right. Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. It does get into this. This is another issue which I haven't really talked about, which is, intelligence or wisdom or something like that, right? So far we've just been talking about the first cause as being an absolutely simple thing, and now you're sort of bringing in the question of, whether there's kind of intelligence involved, and wouldn't that involve complexity? Maybe I think that's related to your point.
Well, yeah, it'd be analogous. When I say if it needs an explanation, I think the thing that needs an explanation is the more orderly, more simple thing, and the thing that doesn't need an explanation is the more chaotic thing.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. You could go that way. I think this is probably an attractive alternative, actually, would be to say that what's ultimately real is a kind of field of all possibilities, right? So,
String
and
theory.
that, in a way, you might say does come kind of close to the Thomistic picture of simplicity, because you might say, look, there's no boundaries; it's just everything. And so, yeah, our little corner of the universe has these fundamental constants, but there's going to be another part that doesn't have those constants, and so they're just all over the place. And any number of particles you want, there's some part of the universe that has that. And so that, I think that's right. So that'd be the sort of Max Tegmark kind of a picture, where you get to simplicity not by going to a single super simple thing, but by just saying, let's just take everything, right? Without any boundaries or limitation, every possible thing, right? So yeah, I think that's right. I still think that there's an intuitive sense in which that's still more complex, right? And a sense in which, how did all that get there, right? All those possibilities, where did they come from? So there's that. And then the other worry is, again, epistemological. This is going to create all kinds of epistemological problems, Boltzmann-brain kind of problems in a huge way, because among all those Tegmark kind of possibilities, there are going to be lots of like little tiny universes that are just my brain popping out of nowhere and then dissolving back into goo again. And there'll actually be a lot more of those than there will be brains like mine that are in this, complex universe that just happens to match the kind of intuitions that I have about the world around me. So, I think I'd have really, really good grounds, if I believe Tegmark's picture, to believe that I'm almost certainly one of those Boltzmann brains, and that, again, all the scientific information I have is unreliable. I think science depends upon believing that the world is biased in a way towards order. And if it weren't, then we'd be in real trouble, I think.
Well, how is that
Just
different from
more.
the God hypothesis? Because, for example, you can conceive of a God being who would create equally as many Boltzmann brains or more Boltzmann brains than real beings. It seems like the only way to assume that would not happen would be to presuppose there's some property or perfection or something inside this thing that makes it stand out and only create a certain kind of beings. But couldn't we just apply that same thing to the Max Tegmark view and say there's some law in there that does the same thing?
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. So, right. And you might say, I'll say something like, well, God loves knowledge, right? And so this is why he doesn't allow Boltzmann brains. He promotes normal sorts of brains. And you might say, aha, then that's a lack of simplicity, right? I'm sort of adding a new attribute into God. And right, so that's, I think, a fair challenge. And the answer, I think, is going to be something like this: that God responds to simply facts about value, of the value of things, the intrinsic value of things, and that doesn't require any internal simplicity in Him whatsoever. Right? He just chooses things on the basis of their having some sort of value. And since knowledge has value, there's a natural bias towards knowledge. And that gets into questions about, okay, where does this objective value come from too? Can we explain that without complicating God to some extent? Okay, so those are good challenges. So we'll have to have another session where we get into some of those in detail. Because fortunately, I've got another commitment coming up here.
Yeah, absolutely. Just one last question. Do you have time for one last question?
Yeah, one more.
Okay, so taking that last thing that God responds to value, couldn't we
Yeah.
create an equivalent mirror image in the Max Tegmark view where the universe responds to some property that exists in the universe?
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. So now it does seem to me like you're getting pretty close to theism, right? So you've got this Tegmark universe, but you've got a sort of foundation to the universe, or a law, right, that governs the Tegmark universe, and it has a bias towards value.
Right. I would
All
just
right.
include there's no consciousness. This is all material things going on here. No consciousness. Got to make sure it's different.
Okay, but I mean, even to say that God is consciousness from a Thomist point of view, right? I mean, that's analogy. It's not sort of a simple fact, right? I don't imagine that God has the sort of qualia that you and I have, or whatever. So maybe we're converging here on a kind of near Thomism anyway. It would be helpful.
So yeah, so it would be possible to do that, to mirror that over to the Max Tegmark view in a kind of naturalistic hypothesis.
I mean, yeah. So it gets into interesting questions about what naturalism means now, right? I'm serious. I think this actually does seem to be pretty close to Thomist picture, right? Because in Thomas's view, you do have a kind of Tegmark like universe of possibilia, right, which are objects of God's knowledge, right? And then you have God who of course aware of all those and sort of is biased towards the good, um, just because that's what any kind of wisdom or any kind of uh, being with knowledge does. Um, I mean, we might have something that's uh, pretty close. Now you might say, is it which view is now naturalism and which is not? Depending on how we define what natural means. Um, I mean, I'm sort of happy if you want to label God natural and be a naturalist. I'm all for it, right? No problem there.
Definitely, yeah, because my goal is to try and mirror the Thomistic view as much as possible to make one distinct difference to show that there's some defeater for it. That's kind of the goal. So I'm trying to mirror it as much as possible, which is why
Okay.
it's so similar. But I
Yeah.
think I just need to learn more about Thomism to find how to articulate that difference.
Yeah. Excellent. No,
So
you're
yeah,
doing a
thanks for
great
coming
job.
on. Really appreciate it. It was a great conversation. I will let you
Likewise.
get to work.
All right. Thank you. Bye.